I'm going to talk about Stalin's foreign policy between 1928 and 1941. So crucially, the years from Stalin's consolidation of power up until Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. The questions that I want to address in this are what were the aims and what were the achievements of Stalin's foreign policy between the years of 1928 and 1941? What did they set out to do and what did they ultimately achieve? And by the time we come to the end of this, I will have presented some analysis of what the Soviet Union achieves during the 1930s with respect to its aims. It's also worth considering, though, that these aims don't necessarily remain constant, and we'll look at what shifts. Crucially, after 1933, with the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, and the very real threat of war that presents to the Soviet Union. We also need to consider, as we go through, why the Soviet Union was unable to form an alliance with Britain and France during the 1930s, despite repeated efforts. We also need to think about why the Soviet Union ultimately concluded a pact with Nazi Germany in 1939. All of these are important issues in understanding not just the aims of Stalin's foreign policy, but also in understanding what was actually achieved. Well, the first thing then is to look at what were the aims of Stalin's foreign policy. To put it very simply, Stalin had one clear aim, and that was to avoid the Soviet Union being drawn into a war. And a war that he was convinced from the 1920s onwards was permanently on the horizon. This war became ever more realistic after 1933 with the rise of Nazi Germany, but events of the 1920s, including a rupture of diplomatic relations with Great Britain in 1927, had led to a war scare and led to a reorientation in foreign policy as well as domestic policy in 1928. And to some extent, the foreign policies of the period that I'm talking about go hand in hand with some of the domestic policies of the Soviet Union at the time. But Stalin was keen to avoid war through concluding, on the one hand, defensive alliances with other states in Europe, either bilateral or multilateral, so that is involving one other party or involving a number of other parties, or creating a web of alliances. There was also the possibility for agreement with Nazi Germany, although, at least as far as I am concerned, this would seem to have been less the aim until we get to August 1939, when finally that is the remaining option after an agreement with Britain and France has not materialized. But crucially, Stalin, despite the fact that he wished to avoid war, was very aware that it was almost inevitable, should there be a war in Europe, that the Soviet Union would have to fight. In 1928, Soviet military capabilities were actually quite weak. The Soviet Union was in no position to fight in 1928. Ironically, given that the war scare prompted by the rupture in British relations in 1927 was a concern about a capitalist imperialist war being launched against the Soviet Union, neither Britain nor France, for that matter, were in any position themselves to fight a war in the late 1920s. So we need to think about what Stalin then does as part of a general rearmament within Europe during the late 20s and 1930s, with war almost constantly on the horizon. But what Stalin crucially was aware was that if the Soviet Union would have to fight, then the Soviet Union needed to catch up with the other powers of Europe, both industrially and militarily. And he famously said that we are 50 to 100 years behind the West. We must catch up within 10 years or go under. Ultimately, as we shall see, Stalin was to get his 10 years, was to get the space to consolidate Soviet power in his own hands, but also to develop Soviet industry, crucially with Soviet industry geared towards a defense capability. At the same time, though, Stalin also had another strand to his foreign policy, And this is a strand which had existed since the Russian Revolution and would continue. And that was the strand of world revolution. And although, as we shall see, that becomes increasingly marginalized during the 1930s, it remains an important aspect of Stalin's foreign policy. Sometimes it has been alleged that the policy of world revolution was only for show, was to keep European and international communists happy and to keep them sympathizing with the Soviet Union. But it represents a very real strand of foreign policy. So what we see really are two aims in Stalin's foreign policy thinking between 1928 and 1941. On the one hand, an avoidance of war and security for the Soviet Union. On the other hand, world revolution, the export of the Russian Revolution and a hope that revolution would take hold throughout the world. These two policies sometimes come into friction with one another, and in fact are frequently at odds with one another. The one cannot exist at the same time as the other, and this becomes quite difficult, and probably leads largely to the marginalization of world revolution as state security becomes increasingly more important towards the end of the 1930s. But it's worth us thinking, what happened between 1928 and 1941? What are the crucial aspects of Stalin's foreign policy? The first thing that we see is in 1928 is that domestically Stalin launches the Great Break, a program designed to revolutionize Soviet industry and agriculture, aimed over a series of 5-year plans, the first of which is launched in 1928, to develop Soviet industry and to develop Soviet armament capabilities. We also see, though, in 1928, the launch of a program of policy within the Comintern. With what had happened through Soviet analysis was that capitalism was seen to be in its final death throes. And it was declared in 1928 that the world was entering a third period, or indeed the Soviet Union, at least, was entering this. What emerged were two doctrines from the Comintern, one of class against class, a revamping and stepping up of militant Marxist ideas aimed at creating revolution, but also as increasingly the threat of a rise of fascist states, with Mussolini's Italy already in place during the 1920s, and increasing problems in Germany. That there was also to be an intense campaign aimed against socialists and liberals who were seen, in fact, to be facilitating the rise of fascism rather than preventing it. There is a paradox in the third period that, in fact, this is where we see the Comintern, the revolutionary foreign policy of the Soviet Union, at its peak and at its most focused purely on communist ideology. Paradoxically, though, it does more harm than good. Having accused socialists and other parties on the left of facilitating the rise of fascism through the policy or doctrine of social fascism, in fact, what was to happen during the 1930s was that as the Soviet Union, through its foreign policy and through the Comintern, needed some of these people back as allies after the consolidation of the German state in Hitler's hands, was that in fact these wounds were never really healed. But there are other things going on. In 1929, the Soviet Union signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which expressly stated that the signatories to the treaty would forego armed conflict as a means of settling their differences. This is perhaps the peak of idealism, but also shows Soviet thinking. That in fact, if the Soviet Union can become a signatory to pacts that have a worldwide nature, then in fact war might be avoidable. At the same time, the Soviet Foreign Commissar Maxim Litvinov calls, perhaps overstating things, but for universal disarmament, arguing from the logic that if all states put aside their arms, then war can no longer take place. While ultimately the Kellogg-Briand Pact was to prove to be worthless, it did encapsulate at least some of the idea, a hope from Soviet quarters that in fact the Soviet Union could avoid war by making sure that war, in a grander sense, was impossible or impractical. The next step, however, in Soviet foreign policy really comes about after the rise of Hitler in 1933. We see an immediate shift in Soviet foreign policy towards a creation of a system through treaties and through other agreements to try and safeguard against a war which Germany will bring to Europe and which would inevitably draw the Soviet Union into it. In September 1934, the Soviet Union joins the League of Nations. While the League of Nations was ultimately to prove to be too weak, largely through a lack of involvement by the United States, to actually deal with the crises of the 1930s, most notably with 1935 in Abyssinia, but also earlier in the 1930s with Japan, Soviet membership of the League of Nations sent out signals that the Soviet Union wished to be dealt with by other powers on an equal footing, and was now subscribing to an idea of security through cooperation. In 1935, there was then a move towards actually securing some treaties, more than just membership of the League of Nations. And in May, the Soviet Union signed pacts with France and with Czechoslovakia to guarantee their security. This was to prove important in 1938 when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. But built into this, from the Soviet point of view, was the fact that the Soviet Union would not come to Czechoslovakia's aid unless France did initially. At the same time, the Comintern shifted its policy away from the policies of class against class and the doctrine of social fascism, and moved towards the popular front, what Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Comintern, would talk about as the united front against fascism. What is clear is that after 1935, Soviet foreign policy has reorientated itself to deal with a German threat. And the Popular Front was to prove significant in aiding the establishment of Popular Front governments in France and in Spain.